Welcome back. So now we will be diving into some promising practices and population-level approaches, concrete strategies that are making a difference in student lives. Before we begin, I want to share a quick note about how we'll be handling audience Q&A during this section. Due to time constraints, we won't have a live Q&A. We're using Slido. We will gather your questions immediately after every presentation, and then we will try and respond to them in the follow-up materials with written responses. So after each presentation, we'll take a minute or two. You'll see the slide up there. It has instructions on it, so hopefully this works, and hopefully it's relatively self-explanatory, but there will be a QR code or a 7-digit code you can just enter to enter your questions. With that, I would like to reintroduce Marge Malpede, who will be moderating these discussions.
Hi, I'd actually like to just call to the stage Gerard Senehi. Gerard is the founder of Open Futures Institute and the Question Project, which we're going to be discussing next. And Michael Barakat. Michael is the principal of the Bronx High School for Law and Community Service. Thanks, guys. So today we're going to be talking about an incredibly interesting and exciting project that I had the honor of actually seeing in action when I visited Bronx Academy for an article that I was writing for Learning Well magazine at the request of Gerard, who called and said, "You have got to see this thing in action. It's called the Question Project." So what we want to do today is give you a little bit of an overview of what that is, and then talk to these two kind of about how it works. When I was visiting the classroom, I'll just give you a snippet. I think there's some good photos. You saw fantastic young people who are 15, 16 years old talking about what they thought their purpose in life might be. Did they ever think about what it feels to be a fellow human being? And speaking of which, there wasn't a phone in sight. And it was really a remarkable experience. But that was my experience. Now these guys are going to tell you a little bit more about it. We're going to start with Gerard. Gerard, can you explain to us just a bit of an overview of what the Question Project is first? And then it's sort of a two-part question. And why you and your co-creator decided that this was an important thing to do.
Good afternoon, I guess. So it's the Question Project is, at its core, it's engagement with students' humanity, to connect with themselves, with life, and with others. And it's a structured journey through some of the most important questions about life. So we spent 2 years working with university students to define, what are the most important questions about life? What are questions that are part of the transition from adolescent to young adult? And eventually, then we worked 2 years with high school students, and eventually it led to a curriculum. And the curriculum is a structured journey through those questions. So the journey starts with choice, to connect students with their agency, with their identity and agency. And in exploring, in connecting them with choice, they really connect with who they are. Not as a set of labels, like this is me, I'm like this, I'm like that, but they start to connect that there's a self in here who is making choices, who has choices, who is relating to it, who is trying to figure it out. Then the next unit is on purpose, where they get to explore how purpose can show up in their lives, how purpose shows up at different times in one's lives. I think one of the things that happened on the day when you came, kids were like, it's such a relief not to have this idea that there's only one purpose for me that I have to discover. So they connect with the reality of purpose. We approach all of this non-materialistically, so it's not that they have to come up with an answer. And then after the unit on purpose, it's fearlessness, where explore the courage that it takes to be oneself. You know, that's such a fundamental part, and then kids really connect at that point. It's really about me and who I am and how I'm showing up in the world and my own life. And then the next unit is interconnectedness. Beyond themselves, they start to explore what it means to be in relationship to others, relationship to nature, to life. And lastly, bigger picture. Is there a bigger picture? How do I look at things from a bigger picture? So that's the journey that they go. And the most important part is that it's structured in a way that engages their humanity. So it's not just their intellect, it's not just their personal experience, it's really their process of making sense out of life together. And it's a rare space where they can see each other struggle with, engage with life itself.
So Gerard, maybe I'll hold off on the second part, because you did such a great job of describing it, but I'd also like Michael to really jump into this space. So, Michael, you use the Question Project. Your students are going through this. As a principal, because this is not just a great exercise, it's actually a very solid academic pursuit. What attracted you to this program, and how are you seeing it sort of influence your students?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work, because I think it really has been transformative for our students. By way of the practical, at Bronx High School for Law and Community Service, we're a New York City public high school, comprehensive 9 through 12, very traditional in many ways. And the Question Project is a one-semester course that all of our freshmen take 5 days a week, like they would take math, science, social studies, or English. And what attracted me to the Question Project is twofold. One, in the social emotional space, we've been approached by many different models that often give us very lofty goals, but didn't necessarily give us ways in which we could apply those lofty goals to 14-year-olds. The second, and for us more pressing issue, and I think more important for today's conversation, is that we were experiencing some of the lags of development, or the differences in the arc of development that were just discussed. And we were sending students to college and university academically prepared, but they were reporting to us as alumni of our institution that they were not social emotionally prepared. They were not prepared to engage in conversations about what they understood their purpose to be, what they understood their life experience to be. And what we found after implementing this freshman course and working with this material over the years is that when it came time for students to apply to colleges and universities, they were able to take experiences which are often, in our case, student experiences that are life in an urban center, life in many cases in underrepresented populations, and articulate what their human experience is, both in terms of a written essay in the college essay process, but also once they got past the threshold of the college or university, be able to interact with people that they have not had previous experiences interacting before. A lot of our students felt that because of socioeconomic barriers or because of identity barriers, that their story was not important and their story was not worthy of the academy. And one of the things that the Question Project does such a good job at helping students do, even at a young age of 14 years old, is to be able to encapsulate their personal experience in the broader context of a human experience. And that's the connection that they're able to make, both when they're representing themselves as a potential college student, but also when they're representing themselves to others for the first time they get on campus. And that's been transformational. We were preparing students for college and university academically, but we did not necessarily have the tools to prepare students for the very important social, emotional, and interconnected activities that are required of most undergraduates to be successful.
Particularly the population of student that you serve. One of your colleagues, I remember saying that this, she explained this benefit of the question project, and she talked about it just as you did in terms of the ability for these students, many high achieving, to get into college. But what you're talking about are the skills to really stick at it, right? We were meant to have a third panelist, Alexander, who was a student who had the question project and went through it and then became a student leader in the program, helping to facilitate it, is now in college at a SUNY school, and he's pursuing acting. I interviewed him. He couldn't come today because he didn't want to miss class. So we said that was okay. But one of the things he had said to me was that when he went from his close-knit neighborhood in the city to a suburban college, he, all of a sudden, was one of very few people he was used to being within all, among all black and brown students. And he said that that challenge was difficult for him, and he relied on these five pillars that he learned, literally went back and talked about each one and how that really helped with his resilience. So I love that story. I'm telling it for him. I'm not doing it justice. But practically, Michael, how does this work at your school? How do your teachers get into this? And what is that sort of teacher-facilitator dynamic like in the classroom? I've seen it, but describe it for us.
Yeah, I mean, in throughout our curriculum and throughout our faculty, we want teachers to see themselves as facilitators rather than instructors, just because of some of the generational trends that we talked about, but also, keep going back to our Socratic roots. We want to hear our student voice. And what is fascinating about both the training that is provided for the students in the question project, but also for the faculty, for the teachers, is that there's a really in-depth kind of focus and journey of the self. You can't lead a discussion about shared humanity and be one step removed from that as a teacher or as a facilitator. And so Gerard and Francesca put our teachers through a kind of boot camp, if you will, of self-discovery. So the conversation in the classroom becomes much more holistic in terms of what do we have in common rather than what makes you individual and what makes you unique. And I think that's a key component. We see so often in reference to the last discussion about social media, we see so often students trying to identify what's unique about them. I mean, even with the regard to the college application process, right? We want to show what's unique about that student. But in an increasingly isolated population, that being the generation of students that we're working with now, the uniqueness often becomes a barrier to shared humanity. And that's really what the facilitator does in that class, is try to make the connections between these bigger questions about who am I, what do I have to offer to the world, what is my purpose, and how do we all struggle with these same questions. And I think that's key to bridging whatever differences we may see or experience, to understand that underneath all of it, we all have these questions. And that's why it's called the question class, because it is our questions about who are we, why are we here, and why are we doing any of this that really unite us far beyond any of the social emotional programming that seems to be performative. Right. Rather than everybody getting in a circle and talking about what their favorite color is, it's a much more intrinsic experience to have everybody get around the table and talk about the questions that they have about who they are and why they're here, and where, at 14, 15 years old, where they're going.
It's true. One of the students that I had interviewed said something that was so incredibly quotable. He said, one of the things I love about the question class is no one's ever asked me these questions before. So my question for you, Gerard, tell us a little bit about why you created this, and having listened last night and today, why you think it's so important not just in general, but also for the higher ed audience as well?
Yeah. I guess the initial prompt was my own journey of education and coming to the U.S. when I was 12. It was a breakthrough for me. I felt like being treated as a human being in middle school. And then high school and starting to enter young adulthood, being very confused about life and feeling like I'm not sure why I'm going to college. Howard Gardner and Wendy Fishman did a study of 10,000 students and education stakeholders and discovered that there were more than 50% had a mindset of I'm going to college because I'm supposed to, or because it's a transaction for me to get a better job. And so I was a little bit in this, well, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. But actually, when I look back at my experience, I was actually trying to understand myself. I took psychology, but it was about rats. Philosophy was about ideas. I was like, but I wasn't conscious that I was actually trying to understand myself, life, and the world and others. So that was a long journey, and I feel that, when I hear a lot of the conversation around mental health and social media, I think social media is a profound accelerant, but underlying, if there's a disconnection from oneself, is if there's a disconnection from others and a disconnection from life, then that's where we can actually find a solution. But we're constantly digging to make that humanly real, because it's so easy to treat these things. Like I tell my team, let's not use the word when we train teachers that we're going to do an exercise now, because it kind of materializes it and takes it out of the realm of, we're really engaging young people, engaging teachers on a human journey. And I think as we bring in programs and different programs, I think it's so important to reach for the core of what makes us human, especially at this time when there's so much risk of disconnection, fragmentation, and division.
For both of you, one of the things that I think could be a benefit of it, and you've mentioned it, is this sense that this isn't happening to me. This is happening to all of us as sort of humankind. And that to me sort of sounds like, it's not civics, but it sort of sounds a little bit like what the presidents were talking about in terms of productive discussions and learning over difference and that kind of thing. Do you see that emerging, and could that be something that would actually help students as they go into college and have these very difficult conversations?
Well, I'll say this. As you mentioned before, the vast majority of the students who attend my school are underrepresented in many ways. And that leads to a psychosis of feeling that what you have to offer is not really good enough for prime time. Certainly not good enough for university or college. And when students start to understand that the very same people that they may look up to or may be intimidated by are also having the exact same questions that they're having, then what I see in students is not only a self-confidence, but a self-possession that I can have these questions, and it's okay for me to have these questions because everybody has these questions about self, about purpose, about interconnectedness. About how to bridge the gap between being a stranger and being somebody who I can engage with. And so I think that it's really crucial, we were talking about affinity groups before, it's really crucial to know that no matter what groups or tribes or affinity groups we belong to, that within that, underneath all of that, we're still asking ourselves these very profound questions that no one has an answer to, and the answer changes over our lives and over time. To let young people know that they're not isolated in those questions, to let young people know that when they're going into a college situation, they don't have to know it all. They don't have to be some profoundly deep individual, but rather they have to be somebody who's profoundly curious, both about themselves and their experience and about the people around them. That's what opens up learners. That's what opens up a learning space. And, you know, as a high school principal, my first thought was, what do I have to talk about with people who are in your position in colleges and universities? And what I was shocked to learn today already is that we're asking the same questions. We're asking the same questions about how can we help our young people emerge from darkness, right? That's our job, educare, education. We're supposed to lead people out of darkness. And yet what we just saw up here is that our students are increasingly alone, increasingly in darkness, increasingly isolated. And so what can we strip away so that they have that connection, that they have that understanding that there is a baseline, a base humanity that we all share that makes us unique on the earth as humans, but makes us all very similar as people. And I think that's the power, you know, that bridges some of the socioeconomic gaps that I was talking about, some of the social, racial tensions that often lead my students specifically to feel like they have to hide themselves. And instead say, okay, I have a place in this conversation because this is a conversation that we all engage in and a question that we're all asking. And that's what Gerard and the Open Future Institute have done so well, is to really distill their curriculum into these very fundamental questions that none of us can claim to have answers to, and therefore we're all on an equal footing.
Amazing. I think, oh, sorry, Gerard, why don't you have the last word?
Sure. Thank you. That was beautiful. I think that in a way, a lot of the exploration that we're having about how we can support our university and college students and high school students, this dimension of our humanity, which I also want to be careful how I use that word because everything becomes like a label, a thing. But like Michael was speaking, is when that is brought in, like even when we speak about belonging, we can belong in all kinds of ways, but different types of belonging still maintain divisions with other people who don't belong to the same thing. So really the critical potential of having spaces where students engage at that level with each other in different ways. Our program is just one example of many ways that they happen. So, yeah, that's what I would conclude with.
I just want to, Gerard is way too modest. There are many, many different ways to attack this, but the way that Gerard is doing it and the way that the Open Future Institute is doing it is so successful across so many different student populations because of the time and care that you've taken to really create a curriculum that is very focused, not wishy-washy, if you will, not touchy-feely, but very academic in an approach to something that is to a discussion that we're often having that is seen as extra academic. So there are many programs, but what you're doing and what we're doing together is unique in this respect.
I'm glad you added that. I would agree. Thanks so much. For anyone who wants to hear more about or learn more about the Question Project, Gerard's information is, I hope it's okay that they can all contact you, but it is really worth following up on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.